Good evening. And at this time, I'd like to call the Anacortes City Council meeting for August 10th, 2020 to order. Ms. Hunt, would you take the roll?
Mr. Carter, Mr. Young,
Here.
Mr. Walters,
Here.
Ms. Cleveland McGrath,
Here.
Ms. Moulton, Mr. McDougall,
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Mayor Gear,
yes, Mr. Miller.
I'd like to make a motion to excuse Mr. Carter as he had required National Guard class to do this evening. Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Miller, a second by Mr. Young. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Well, tonight, before we get into the agenda, I want to talk about the fact we're having a virtual meeting tonight, which means once again we're open for public participation in our council meetings as we move through this COVID-19. All written comments that have been sent in have been sent to council members, so I want to assure the council and the public that we received your written comments and we passed them on to the council. So if those comments relate to a subject tonight, the council will have them or have looked at them as we go through the evening's agenda. When we get to the public comment portion of the evening, I'm going to have Ms. Hunt review our public comment guidelines, and we'll do that in a moment. But I do want to remind everyone that a meeting, a virtual meeting, or whether it's in city council chambers, that all members of the public are required to apply by the same rules we have in any other public meetings. So we want to keep a sense of decorum, and just like we would in person. And the other option is tonight, if there's feedback or we can't hear you or it's disrupting, I may disconnect someone speaking if we're getting a lot of feedback. And if that's the case, call back in. It won't be because I'm just cutting you off, but if so, you know, with an electronic meeting, we're not sure how that's going to go. So that's my opening comments on virtual meetings. And when we get to public comment, Ms. Hunt will review how we'll go through that. So now we're going to move on to item 2, and 2A is COVID-19 update. So the latest information I have for you all is at Island Hospital, they have tested over 3,430 people to date. We've had 49 positive cases in our community, and we've had 9 people in our community actually stay in the hospital. We've had no deaths. As of this afternoon in Skagit County as a whole, we had 22 new cases over the weekend and 10 new cases today. That brings us to a total of 890 cases, 629 recoveries, 85 people have been hospitalized, and we now have had 22 deaths in Skagit County. Currently, Skagit County only meets one of the 5 metrics required to move from phase 3 as of 4 p.m. today. And we have 106 cases per 100,000 residents over the last 14 days and 3.9% positive test rates. These metrics are 25 cases or less and 2% respectively. Please encourage everyone to check the risk assessment dashboard for full data, meaning you can go to the Skagit County website and check in there and look at more information on COVID-19 risk assessment. Today, the Skagit County Commissioners awarded over $800,000 in grants to small businesses and nonprofits engaged in COVID-19 relief efforts in Skagit County. So that's incredible that they worked through iaff, and most of the funding came through the CARES Act passed by Congress earlier this year. The main driver in all of our new cases are still family gatherings. Please remind your friends and your family that preferably You just can't go to big family gatherings. You've got to keep it limited as we move forward. And that's really, we want to discourage, the county's asking us to discourage people from participating in activities that require removing your mask, like eating and drinking during visits. Also, a common misconception about staying outside is safer than inside, but please remember that even outside, you're at risk. So that is all I have today, and we just need to mask up, Skagit County, and flatten this curve. Right. So now we'll move on to item 2B, which is our Public Safety Committee report.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
Well, I'm sure Ms. Cleland McGrath would add some more to this, but I'll go ahead and give it a shot. We met virtually last week, and the items that I have written down from that meeting from fire, they wanted to acknowledge a number of letters of support and appreciation from the public, again, working their way through the pandemic and providing the normal great service that they always do. Chief Oliveri went through some organizational stuff just to kind of get the Public Safety Committee reminding of how the organization works. And one of the reasons they did that was there's promotional testing for the opportunity to be a fire lieutenant, and they were he was kind of explaining how that's sort of equivalent to our sergeants in the police department, whereas the captains in our police department are sort of equivalent to our battalion chiefs, kind of thing. So just some organizational stuff. And then the part that we're going to talk about later on tonight is the extension of the contract with the firefighters union. I think we were happy to see that working well with considering everything that's going on with the budget. The firefighters have agreed, and council will talk about it later on about the extension of their contract. From the police side, also, they wanted to recognize, again, the support from Chief Small wanted to recognize the support and encouragement from the public that they're still getting. Talked about their 2 new recruits have been on board for a month and a half, doing a great job, getting lots of positive feedback as well. Also, sergeant testing. And I, of course, needed to be reminded about how that testing works. It's not necessarily that there are positions open, but it allows you to have folks available should promotion opportunities come up. So that's why they go through the testing process. Talked a little bit about drug houses and what some of the tools are to work with. We do have a couple of problem issues in Anacortes, and talked about a little bit about that. And I'm sure there's a couple things I missed. Ms. Cleland McGrath.
The only other thing was that they've received their fingerprinting machine and are currently in training. So they were really excited about that for the police station. Unfortunately, it won't really be available to the public until phase 3 as of now. But yeah, everything else was great, Matt.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions for that committee? All right, we'll move on now to item 2C, our Housing Affordability and Community Services Committee.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Cleland McGrath.
Yeah, so we had our HACS committee meeting with Councilmember Walters and Councilmember Moulton and myself and today. And so we talked a little bit about our rental assistance opportunities for our community. There was some funding that came to the county. Unfortunately, Anacortes didn't receive any of those funds, but fortunately we do have leftover CDBG funding from actually the Wilson Hotel. I think we discussed it at a previous meeting. And so we are going to move forward with dispersing those funds through the Anacortes Family Center. So we are going to work on kind of getting the necessary paperwork so that they can share those funds with those people in need. The other thing that we discussed was the Small Business Stabilization Grant status. So again, a big shout out to Joanne Stewart, who has spent hours on the phone with various local businesses, answering questions and assisting through that process, not just the application, but once they have been chosen, kind of there's a whole other process to be able to receive those funds, right? So she has put in a ton of time. As of now, we have paid out $91,653. So that's huge for our local businesses. There are a few businesses who have been awarded funds but have not quite just determined whether or not they will be using them because of the fact that they may receive other funding from other sources. So it's because of that, the restrictions on that funding, we have to be careful, but Joanne is working to figure out how to do that. She's going to kind of follow up with those people and possibly create a deadline so that if those businesses aren't going to utilize those funds, that they can go back in the pot and for new applicants. We've got quite a bit of time to use the money, but we'd rather get it out as quickly as possible. The other thing that we discussed was there was a meeting with Anacortes 100 Food Bank and Helping Hands that we were invited to, and Councilmember Moulton and I were on that meeting talking about possibly a partnership and Helping Hands coming into the community. We did kind of a debrief on that, and that they have got quite, Helping Hands has quite a wraparound services to not only provide and distribute food, but also kind of getting people back to work and trained, and breaking that cycle of poverty. So they wanted to talk to us, and they've reached out to Anacortes 100 Food Bank about maybe partnering. But they would like to know where our holes are in our community and how they could assist. So it was great. We had people from the Red Bag Group and Anacortes Family Center and quite a few stakeholders, representatives from Deborah Lankenoff and Senator Lovelit, and then also Alex Rammel were on the call. So it was a really good meeting. But we're going to kind of see where that's going. But we wanted to kind of share that with the rest of our Housing and Affordability Committee. So either of you have anything to add to that? No? Okay. And then if it's okay, I will move into the next item, which is our Planning Committee. We had a shortened meeting for our Planning Committee today, same group, Walters and Moulton and I, and we did a little bit of a debrief regarding our site visit with the port. We had the director and their consultant and architect and some of the port commissioners meet at Market Street and 9th and discuss the Northwest Basin and their event center. And it was a good kind of on-the-ground orientation where we could see where some of the street modifications would happen and the corners of their proposed building that they've kind of done rough designs of. So that allowed us to kind of go back and discuss what we're thinking from a city perspective. And we're still formulating our thoughts, but it was a really good experience to be able to walk the property and see sight lines and see connectivity and how it relates to our depot and the depot master plan. So we really appreciated that opportunity to meet with everyone. So thank you to the port. But we will kind of continue to formulate our thoughts when it comes to kind of possibly a development agreement. So yeah, that's where we're at now. So thank you.
It's Cleland McGrath. This is Anthony. Would it be possible later that we get a little bit more in-depth briefing about sort of where we are, particularly the Port City liaison, so we can just be out with you guys? We appreciate the move. It's so necessary and needed. Obviously, I've heard that it went very well and people were very positive about it. So I'd like to have just a little bit more depth of knowledge about it, and so I will reach out to you guys at some point. Okay?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, any other comments on any other reports? All right. Then we're gonna move into public comment, and Marcia Hunt will review this for all of us and for the attendees, and we'll go from there. So, Marcia?
So Mr. Kaufman is displaying the instructions now for offering live public comment at the City Council meetings. To do that, you would join the Zoom meeting, which is shown there in red. You would do that typically before the meeting begins at 6 o'clock. And when the public comment portion of the agenda arises, Mr. Kaufman will unmute any folks who've indicated they wish to speak there in the order they signed up. The same process will happen later in the agenda for any agenda items on which public comment is being accepted. And I believe there's one of those at the end of the agenda tonight. So if you choose not to join online, you're also welcome to just call in on your telephone, and those instructions are shown on the right side of this screen. All of these instructions are also posted many places on the city website, but including in the news flash on the very front page. So those are two options to offer live public comment. The public is also still welcome to submit comments prior to a meeting or after a meeting in writing to our post office box, via email to the city clerk, or via our e-comment feature on the website. We had 7 folks offer comments that way tonight. So all of these have been and are being used by our public. We're getting lots of good public participation. Thank you to Anacortes for that. And I will just also add that if anyone in the public is having any difficulty trying to figure out how to connect, you can email the city clerk, or you can just pick up the phone and call the main city hall number and ask for the city clerk, and they'll get you to me, and we'll get you figured out. So we'll get everybody connected. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Okay, so at this time, we're going to move to item 3, which is public comment. And Mr. Kaufman, do we have anyone waiting to be heard?
Yes, Madam Mayor. We actually have 2 people. I will connect the first one right now.
All right. Well, good evening. Are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, and if you'll state your name and address,
Yes.
and then what you want to talk to us about. Thank you. Welcome to the City Council meeting. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you, Mary Gear. My name is Nick McKay. I live at 2618 R Avenue. Grew up in Anacortes, have been working here forever. I've raised my kids here. And I just I have some more questions and concerns about the housing crisis. As everyone is probably aware, workers like me were declared non-essential, but bill collectors and landlords are still essential. And I have called the city council before to try to get more information. And honestly, the current plan to give a small amount of money to the Anacortes Family Association is probably going to be woefully inadequate. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot of evictions in this wintertime, whenever the governor's stay on evictions ends. It's going to be very, very hard for those of us in that bottom 20% of the labor force to make up 3 months' rent. I mean, that's near impossible to do in any sort of timely fashion to make your landlord happy. And I just was wondering if the city could find another way or some more funds in order to help more people, because I think we are on the verge of a very serious crisis when it comes to homelessness and evictions. If I were to get evicted, I mean, I have a great rental history. Having an eviction on your rental history makes it impossible almost to find new housing. and to continue to take care of my kids and work in the city. So if the Port of Anacortes can prorate $590,000 worth of people's rent till January, perhaps we can come up with some sort of system to get block grants for lower income people, or some sort of system where we can at least get into paying back these massive debts. I've never had anything like this happen before to me in my life, and it's quite a bit of money to just be expected to come up with for your landlord when they come knocking. That's my main concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And if you could reach out to Mr. Meisner at the city or myself, we'll get you some more information, and we'll definitely look. I mean, the council is definitely looking at options. So thank you for coming and speaking tonight. All right. So who's our next person, Mr. Kaufman?
Our next person is Eric Peterson, and I will go ahead and start with the next slide. Yep.
Well, welcome, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor and City Council members. My name is Eric Peterson, and we live at 14489 Gibraltar Road. And I just want to make sure you can hear me nicely.
We can, very clear.
Okay, fantastic. So I wanted to, in my comment period, thank the City Council and the Mayor for their tireless and marathon efforts to develop a way to work with the Anacortes Museum and the Anacortes Museum Foundation to work on the mural projects. This is a very, very important project, I feel, that strikes at the heart of Anacortes. Bill Mitchell was a treasure, and his murals are all over the city. And I think that we've come up with some just really dynamic ways that will continue to attract interest in our town and interest in the way that history has shaped Anacortes. As the treasurer of the Anacortes Museum Foundation, I want you to know that I'm working tirelessly, and so are the rest of the board members and, of course, Brett Lunsford, to raise money annually in support of the stewardship of the Anacortes Mural Project, because it's going to take money. It's going to take money, and it's going to take effort on the behalf of volunteers and those paid staff who are willing to take care of these murals. I think we've come up with a solid plan to be able to move forward on this and be able to rotate those murals through that need help before they are at the point where they're destroyed, because we don't intend to make new murals. We intend to take care of those that we have. So a really big thanks to you folks for even considering a partnership with the museum. I think this is going to go a long way to preserving the legacy of Bill Mitchell. Thank you for my chance to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Kaufman, do we have any other members of the public?
No, we do not.
All right. So at this time, we'll move on to item 4, our consent agenda. And we have the minutes of August 3rd and approval of claims to be approved.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
First of all, I'd like to thank you and the staff, by the way, Matt and Marcia, especially the public comment. I know there's a lot of work to set that up, but I think the rest of the council probably agree with me that it's nice to actually be able to get the direct feedback. The emails are great and all, but I know it was a lot of work to set it up, and so challenging technology, but it sounded great so far. So I just want to say thanks. And I'd like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda items A through B.
Second. Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Miller, a second by Ms. Moulton to approve the consent agenda items A and B. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Now we're going to move on to item 5 under other business. And this is the Critical Areas Regulation Workshop. This is draft 2 coming from the Planning Commission on the general provisions of the and critical areas procedures. This is discussion only this evening, and Ms. Tess Cooper will be doing the presenting. Welcome, Ms. Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor. Tonight, we're going to do an overview of the first two sections of the critical area ordinance draft and discuss the recommended changes from the Planning Commission.
Okay.
First, I'm going to take a brief moment to discuss the proposed plan while I get my share screen to work. You all see that there?
Yes.
Thank you. The Planning Committee has discussed an approach to reviewing the critical area regulations, proposed updates with City Council. And the approach we've decided on is to break the draft down into different sections. Tonight, August 10th, we'll review the general provisions and critical area review procedure section. Next week, August 17th, we will review the wetlands and fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas section. In August 24th, we'll review the last sections, geologically hazardous areas, critical aquifer recharge areas, frequently flooded areas, and any other administrative changes necessary. Then, after these three workshops and discussions occur, staff will take the outcomes of those and the recommendations from City Council and compile it all into the third draft. At that time, once the third draft is all compiled, we'll release it for review by City Council, staff, and announce it to the public for a review period, public comment period, and then we'll bring that back and have the final hearings with a schedule to be determined. We just want to let everybody know what the proposed plan is, that we're gonna discuss it, then we'll compile a new draft, and then we'll open public comment period and have hearings over that. So the next three meetings are really just an overview presentation as well as a discussion with City Council specifically. Does anybody have any questions about that approach? Okay. Now, are you seeing the split screen or are you seeing the full screen there? Apologize.
Split screen. Which isn't necessarily bad. There you go. That's better. Yep.
But that's, yeah, that's not the...
Beth, if you go
Yeah.
to the display settings, you click on that, you can swap the two.
Oh, display settings. Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Does that work? That's for everybody now? Great. Okay. So, critical area review of the regulations update. Just a quick reminder that we're doing this because the Growth Management Act mandates cities and counties to develop comprehensive land use plans and development regulations to include critical area regulations. So again, really the context of these regulations is that they are development related and specifically land use related under the Growth Management Act. What you need to know this presentation will, one, provide a brief overview of the draft itself and go over all the critical area regulations in each section, very summary-like. And we'll also provide a discussion on the proposed changes. And then if there are any other discussion or changes that come from that, we can discuss those as well with City Council members. I've color-coded the sections. So a change that we made from the current chapter into draft 2 will be shown in blue. Changes that came from the Planning Commission and that they recommend changes specifically to draft number 2 will be shown in red. And then additional changes that we found going through the draft after all of that that are new to City Council for review and approval are shown in yellow. I want to show you the new layout. You can see them side by side here. The existing Chapter 1770, which is the current regulations, and the new proposed Chapter 1970. The existing has an introduction section which involves multiple appendices that talk about the history of the acquisition of Anacortes community forest lands, as well as valuable species to Anacortes. Then it goes directly into the 5 different critical area categories: frequently flooded areas, aquifer recharge areas, geologically hazardous areas, wetlands, and fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. The last section, it just says that marine shorelines points to the shoreline master program. In the new draft regulations, we have created 2 new preemptive sections that are umbrella sections that summarize all of the requirements for all of the 5 different categories of critical areas. And so the first is general provisions, and the second is critical area review procedures. And this is the outline of the new general procedures section. It starts on page 5 if you have your drafts with you to page through as we go through this discussion. And again, it specifies all of the following provisions for all of the 5 critical area categories. Number 1 is the purpose. Number 2 is the applicability. Number 3 is the identification, classification, and rating of critical areas. Protection standards, general requirements, critical area review, exempt activities, permitted alterations, and reasonable use exceptions. As you can see, it just improves the regulatory context and guidance for administration of the regulations.
Mayor Garrett? Ms. Moulton?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Cooper. I'm hoping you can take me back a step just for some fill-in background. I was wondering how the decision was made to take out all of the history of the endangered species and the history of land acquisition. And if that information isn't here in this document, will it be in another place, in another document?
That's a good question and a concern that was raised by quite a few folks in the public comment. And the decision to remove all of that contextual text from the document was to simplify and provide an actual codified document. These are the regulations in a codified format for following, where the other items were very lengthy textual appendices, which can remain on file or which can be placed in certainly other locations, the growth management or possibly comprehensive plan or especially the history of the ACFL can be placed in the proposed new title for regulating the ACFL itself. But it's an inappropriate place to put those text documents in a codified document. So that's the reason why staff has chosen to remove them.
Okay, thank you. That is helpful. I would hate to see those things lost. I agree, it was very wordy. It could definitely be edited, but I think some of the information is really vital to understanding our city and our natural areas and our commitment to those natural areas and what we value as a community. And I would like those sections to be saved in a place that they will be easily accessed, because they're very much a part of who we are as a city.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
I want to comment on that a little bit further. I agree with Ms. Cooper that we should remove those from the document because they're not regulations, and this isn't the place to be writing novels. It's the place to be writing succinct regulations that people can follow. And it's not a good place for this document to live because it's data about how much acreage we have in any particular time that might need to be updated over time. Certainly there's a place for that to go elsewhere, as Ms. Moulton suggests. But at the time that we adopted this, the city of Anacortes, and I think I was in high school then, testifying before the city council about a critical areas ordinance that we didn't have, and that the city of Anacortes had to be drawn kicking and screaming to adopt a critical areas ordinance, even though it was mandated by state law. And when I read that section, maybe different than Ms. Moulton does, I read it through that viewfinder of the city of Anacortes putting into its own code, yeah, we will go ahead and adopt a critical areas code because the state tells us we have to. But we have all this forest land over here. Isn't that enough? And I am really eager to be doing away with this section as part of the critical areas code, because no, it's not enough. It is great that we have the forest lands, but we also have critical areas, including geohazard areas that are really important all throughout town. So it is correct, completely correct, as Ms. Cooper says, it's inappropriate for it to be in the code itself, and I'm glad to get rid of it. And if we keep it, we need to rewrite it to make sure it actually reflects current data and our current feeling on the protection of critical areas.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. Any other comments on that portion? Okay, Ms. Cooper, go ahead.
Mayor Gear, if I might.
Yes, Mr. Young.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in just a little bit on it. I agree that, maybe this is not an appropriate place to have it because, again, as Mr. Walters and Ms. Cooper has stated, that you were codifying the regulation itself. But I also agree that the language of how we got here is important for the future. And I think it's important that we remember that. So if there is a way, whether that means we work on the language or not, I think it should be some place that it can be referenced. Because I think it just sort of bodes to the whole history of how we got here, why it's important. And I agree with you as far as the structural, but I think that history and background is very important to the city and future generations that we want to put forward. So if we can figure out how to do that, I would be very happy with it.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Any other comments?
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
Well, since we're on the page 5 and the purpose, one of the things I highlighted in the document, and seems like an appropriate time to call it out. Obviously there's the critical balance between our critical areas, wetlands usually being the biggest one that impacts land use. So I wanted to just highlight the number 5. Not that I think there should be any changes, but since this is the start of the process for the council, I want to do everything I can to get this word out. And we specifically say in the general provisions, alert owners, potential purchasers, real estate agents, appraisers, lenders, builders, developers, other members of the public to the natural conditions that pose hazards or otherwise may limit developments. And the biggest ones for us are things like, landslide areas and wetlands that impact that. And there are significant wetland changes in this document. So I would encourage members of the public, members in those fields to start taking a look exactly what we may be doing in this document. That's all I wanted to say on this page 5.
Okay, very good. All right, Ms. Cooper, I think you can move on.
Certainly, thank you. If there are any other comments or questions about these sections that I don't go over, please feel free to stop and ask those. So the first change proposed by the Planning Commission to note and to discuss is a minor change. Staff realized that there was a little bit of lack of correct wording. So to make it more explicitly clear, the statement just added within the maximum buffer distances. So we're talking about, unless explicitly exempted, the provisions of this chapter apply to all land use, development activity, and all structures and facilities within the city of Anacortes that are within the critical area, within the maximum buffer distance of, or likely to affect the functions and values of one or more critical areas. We wanted to just make it clear that it's within the critical area and within the buffer. And so that was just a semantics change in that statement.
Right. Any other comments on that? Okay.
Staff want to take a second to highlight this new section, protection of critical areas, because some of the comments and concerns was that this approach seemed to remove protections and reduce protections, and most of that was coming from the contextual removal of that history. But we want to specifically show you that this section, protection of critical areas, adds the specificity of it, but these two bold C and D add even more protection that was not specified in the past document. And so critical areas and the required buffers may not be altered except for allowed in this chapter. Actions taken pursuant to this chapter must result in equivalent or greater functions and values as determined by best available science. And really specifically, all actions in development must be designed and constructed in accordance with mitigation sequencing per AMC 1970-135 to achieve no net loss of critical area functions and values. The requirement to use mitigation sequencing is industry standard and recommended in the Washington Department of Ecology's mitigation manual. It's pretty much understood across the board, but yet our previous document did not reference it or require mitigation sequencing. So that's a really big improvement for this body of regulations. And then applicants must first demonstrate an actual inability to avoid and reduce impacts before restoration and compensation of impacts will be allowed. So that mitigation sequencing is those: you must avoid, you must reduce, or you must restore and compensate. But this is saying that without your actual demonstrated inability to avoid, you can't move on to the next sequences. So that's a specification that that adds a pretty strict standard to these requirements that we just wanted to point out to the group while we're going over the document. No activity or use may be allowed that results in a net loss of functions, and any individual critical area joined by another type of critical area must have a buffer and meet the requirements. So again, it just adds context to the regulations.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
That section there references subsection or section 135, but it's actually, I think, 125 that is the mitigation sequencing section. And I wanted to look for that section because it seems to me that that statement that you have to demonstrate an actual inability to avoid or reduce the impacts is a good one, but shouldn't it be in the mitigation sequencing section? I mean, that's where you're going to look for all the information about how to mitigate.
The numbering in the draft itself, let me see, 135, correct, it's field markings.
Yeah, 125 is mitigation requirements.
125, thank you. It's actually 125. So I will make sure to note that, and we'll make that change.
Any other comments on that, right, Council? Okay. Go ahead.
If there aren't any other comments, I just want to address the second part in that the sequencing, we can look at the wording. The sequencing itself says you must do A, then B, and then C. So it really probably doesn't need to be stated here separately. I think we've just added that in for extra protection. But I can certainly pull up the document and we can look at it now if you want to while we're thinking about it and talking about it.
Good.
Standards, detailed construction plan, monitoring, contingency. Monitoring reports. So I think it's 120 actually instead of 125. Mitigation sequencing. This section applies to mitigation required with all critical areas review, approval, and enforcement. Pursuant to this chapter, the section is supplemented with specific measures under subchapters for particular critical area type. Mitigation for specific development proposals must include a combination of the measures below and must be designed and constructed in accordance with the provisions of this section. Before impacting critical areas, an applicant must demonstrate that the following actions have been taken in the following sequential order. So number one, they have to demonstrate that they've avoided the impact. Do you think there's a way we could word that to be stronger, Mr. Walters, or do you think that that covers your concern?
Mayor,
Walters.
if you scroll down a little bit, subsection B there is the language that we have on page 8, and it seems to me that that should just be part of avoid. So it clearly indicates step 1, avoid, and this is what avoid means. You must demonstrate the ability to avoid before you can go to the next step, or maybe that should be at the introduction of those steps. I guess there are a lot of ways to skin the cat there, but what I primarily oppose is inclusion of the language twice, because that leads to document bloat, and then we change it in one spot and leave it alone in the other, and then it's out of sync. And with the new Unified Development Code, we're trying to get more streamlined, more componentized, and less duplicative.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Lawson?
I also wonder, to Mr. Walters' point, that first section we were just looking at, C and D, those make it almost sound like all development is going to be required to have mitigation. Is that the case? Like, does it fit there under protection of critical areas? Because not everything will require mitigation, will it?
Mitigation sequencing and mitigation itself are a little bit different. Mitigation, so first is you must avoid. If you can avoid it, then there's no mitigation required.
Right.
Then if you have to minimize it, then you have to, or if you can't rectify it, then you have to compensate for it. So it's down here in number 5. Once you get to that stage, then there's going to be mitigation required. But the mitigation sequencing leads you to the fact of whether your project will need mitigation or not need mitigation.
Right. So when we go back to those two, that C and D that were in bold, that you were mentioning, the added strength to the protections, maybe that doesn't need to be there, like Mr. Walter said, because it makes it look like everything. It says all actions in development must be designed and constructed in accordance with mitigation sequencing for AMC 1970. So maybe it doesn't belong there in 1970-025.
Yeah, that makes sense that it's duplicative. What do you think it makes more sense to remove it from the applicability section or from the actual mitigation requirements section?
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters?
I think it's useful for 1970-025 to give the general outline of how the protection of critical areas is achieved, so that the reader of the chapter starts there and reads that critical areas and their required buffers can't be altered except as allowed, and that they're going to have to follow mitigation sequencing with the cross-reference to go read more about that, but without duplicating the language, because duplication can result in getting out of sync and just increase the number of words. So I think that 1970-025 maybe in its entirety can be tightened up to include the right cross-references to various places in the document where you can go learn more details, but also provide that overview of how the critical area protection is achieved by the chapter.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, moving forward.
Mayor Gear, so in the very next section, 1970-030, there's an introductory line that says, as part of the review, the city will, and then it says what we'll do. But it doesn't specify what review that is. It talks about an applicant, but it doesn't talk about what type of application. If that's the critical areas permit application, then I think maybe we should spell that out. Or if it's part of any general application that comes into the planning department, it could say that too.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. 1970-035. This is critical areas review. Specifies when it will be required, how it is required to meet best management practices, and modifications to existing non-conforming structures and uses, how these don't necessarily need to meet the same review criteria. We noticed as we moved it from section 1770 to 1970-035, that the state ferry terminal section was accidentally omitted. And so the Planning Commission recommendation of a change is to add the state ferry terminal language back in as a non-conforming structure and use that may be modified within a wetland buffer. Does that make sense?
Mr. Walters.
I'd suggest that language be tweaked a little bit just to make it clear that the state ferry terminal can be redeveloped within its existing footprint. The way it's currently written, which I assume is the old language, it says you can't go beyond the footprint. And then it says you can redevelop it. I think the point is that you can redevelop the ferry terminal. So I'd tweak that.
So we want it to specifically say you may redevelop, but only within this same footprint?
Yeah, that's limitation, because each of the rest of the list items are things you can do, routine maintenance and repairs, structural modifications or additions. So the language should be parallel.
Any more discussion on state ferry terminal? Or this critical area review section in general?
So I have a question. What if the Washington State Ferries came into a lot of money someday and they came back to us and they wanted to expand the footprint? What would be the process, or what is that an absolute based on, I don't know. I just want to make sure we've thought about this a little bit.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I was thinking, I appreciate you bringing that up. I was thinking the same thing. There's got to be a process for some sort of either, whether it's mitigation. I haven't gone through the A through D mitigation point, but certainly if they could go outside the existing footprint and have zero impact on the wetlands, obviously I think we should support that. I do not like the idea of putting language that just says outright you cannot go outside your existing footprint, but I'm guessing there's some mitigation processes that I haven't read yet.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
Yeah, the reason it has the language about you can't go beyond the footprint is simply that the footprint gets the exemption. If you want to go beyond the footprint, you can. You just have to follow the rules everybody else has to.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you.
Yes, these are really the list of exceptions to the following critical area rules.
Okay.
You're doing routine maintenance or repairs, you're an exception to the following permitting requirements.
Okay.
Structural modifications that don't intensify the non-conforming, you're an exception to the following permit requirements. And same thing as if the state ferry terminal is staying within the same footprint, they're an exception. They're going to expand and they will have to now follow the new permit requirements.
Okay. Perfect.
And so that leads us in to the major change in how we organize the permit requirements and the permit types. Previously, there was exempt activities, and as you can see, it was listed titled as uses by right in Title 17, which was a kind of unclear term, at least in common critical area terminology. And then there was the reasonable use exceptions, and conditional use permits. And those were the only two options that there were. You either were an exemption and did not have to meet critical area requirements, or if you wanted to modify a critical area, you had to go through the conditional use permit. To make it a little more clear, in the text itself and in the languages, there were in each section listed as allowed uses, but they didn't have any specific permit requirements. It didn't say which category it fell into or what the review criteria for those were. So we've created a new category for those previously allowed uses and a few additional ones which are common in other jurisdictions to make it a lot more clear and defined on what activities fall under which categories. And it's meant to mimic the shoreline permit process as well, shoreline exemptions, shoreline substantial development permits, and shoreline conditional uses and variances. And so exempt activities are, and this is what's really been confusing in the comments and the feedback we've been receiving from the public, is that exempt activities are just that. These are activities, and we've predefined minor activities that do not constitute development and aren't an actual alteration to the critical area ordinance. So this category is listing the specific activities that our regulations are saying are not alteration and do not meet permit requirements. It's not development. And so we have divided this into two sections, those that are outright exempt, very minor, and we'll go over these in a minute, or activities that are still minor activities, but they have a potential, if they're not done correctly, to maybe cause some unintended alterations or consequences to the critical areas. So it's a type 1 ministerial action where they have to notify us that they're doing that and get in a letter of exemption saying, yes, we agree with the activities, you're following best management practices, you can do what you're doing. And we've reviewed to make sure that the scope of what you're doing is not going to impact or have any unintended negative consequences. So as we go through that list, again, that's what we need to remember is these are activities that do not do any alteration or therefore not regulated by the development regulations. The next permitted alterations category is a predefined list of minor development alterations that are preemptively understood to fall under the reasonable use criteria. And these will be type 2 administrative decisions with a SEPA determination for lands covered by water, and will be open to a 14-day public comment period. So the public will still have, there will still be noticing, and there'll still be the ability for the public to comment. And we'll go over a list of these ones here shortly. And then the last category is the reasonable use exceptions, as previously gone through the conditional use permit type. All other minor or major alterations will go through this process if they don't meet the very specific requirements for the other two categories. It is a type 3 permit process with a SEPA determination and a 21-day public comment period with an open record public hearing in front of the hearing examiner. So exempt activities, the specific list for qualifying as an exempt activity is an emergency. Emergencies don't actually, you get to take action now, but you still have to come back and do the permitting. So it doesn't exempt you outright from permitting, but it says that you can save your property and then come back and do the proper requirements. Yard and garden activities are an exemption if it's a legally existing landscaped, residentially landscaped or type yard and garden. Site investigation work such as surveying, soil logs, and so forth. Passive outdoor activities. We'll talk about this one next. Utility operation, maintenance, and repair. Excuse me. Transportation infrastructure, operation, maintenance, and repair. Recreation areas, operation, maintenance, and repair. Vegetation management, and clearing, grading, and the constructions of fences and arbors if you're within the 10-foot piped stream setback. And these last categories, which are a little more intensive, require that written notice and letter of exemption. And again, this is not a new section. All of these categories were in the existing Title 17 Critical Area Ordinance, either under uses by right or spelled out in the categories of the sections for the different critical areas. They were just consolidated and renamed into this one section for clarity's sake and to meet critical areas industry understood terminology. And again, they're minor enough to not actually alter or be development. And so the next two we are going to discuss is passive outdoor activities in detail, and then I think that's a recreation, operation, and maintenance or repair. So if you have questions or comments about any of the other ones, we can talk about those now. Most of them are straightforward. The main issues were coming with passive outdoor activities and recreation areas, maintenance or repair, which we'll talk about next. Okay, moving on. Passive outdoor activities. Staff attempted to clarify the intent of this section, and we modified the language from Title 17 when we created the new draft. However, we thought we were making it better, but it seemed to create more confusion for the public about what was allowed and what was not allowed. So staff recommended to revert to the original language, and Planning Commission agreed to that change, reverting back to the language that was originally in Title 17 and understood as a use by right. The only change that we are bringing to you now as additional change to discuss, and as you've seen, we've received quite a few comments from the public and concerns, is keeping the word biking in the document. So the language is on the left is what we had originally changed it to. The language on the right in red is what we reverted back to, how it was in the document that people were happy with, except for adding the term biking. So provided they do not require structures, grading, fill, draining, or dredging, except as provided herein or authorized by a critical area permit, outdoor recreational activities, including fishing, birdwatching, hiking, biking, boating, horseback riding, swimming, canoeing, and similar activities with limited environmental impact, are exempt activities. And this is the activity itself. This is not creating new recreational facilities, new trails, new fishing access, and so forth. This is truly the act of walking through the woods, is an exempt activity and does not require a permit.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
I definitely don't like the original draft language when it can be demonstrated that there will be no adverse effect. I don't think that helps us at all. However, in the new language, I also don't like provided they do not require structures. I think they is the wrong word. Provided is not a normal human word. It was better when we had the language, this exemption does not include structures, grading, fill, the creation of those new things. I think that is more straightforward. But also in the list, I think we should definitely include biking, because that's what we're talking about. So as is in parentheses there, yeah, let's put biking in. But also we lost educational activities and scientific research. Did we mean to lose those? Like, why not keep those in the list too?
I believe those were in a different section. I don't believe those were part of this use by right language.
Right. They may not have been part of the old ordinance, but the old ordinance was defective in a number of ways, and this might be one of them. If they're not listed here in some other exemption in the new draft, then maybe we should keep them in this section. Because we were previously calling it passive outdoor activities. If that includes educational activities, Friends of the Forest stuff, all that kind of thing.
Right.
Great. Let's keep that in there and not limit it to just passive outdoor recreational activities.
Mayor Gear.
Yes, Ms. McDougall.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Walters on the inclusion of scientific research and educational activities. And I'm curious, when we say boating, how are we defining boating? And because there's significant non-passive boating activities potentially.
I think the boating is specifically to the ACFL, and whatever boating is under that comprehensive plan and what those use rules are would oversee that for the ACFL.
Got it. So
this is just saying that we're considering it not development or alteration, so we're not including it in the permit requirements. So we could get as detailed as you wanted to, but I'm not sure that it's necessary because we're just saying that these type of activities don't qualify.
Got it. Yeah, if the ACFL rules have jurisdiction, then it's fine.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Miller.
Yeah, I don't have any problem whether you leave the scientific part in there, but I think the idea is, that's kind of a mental activity and you're trying to capture physical activities. But if you want to leave the scientific research part in there, you're probably hiking to get there, maybe boating, maybe on horseback. But I'm not really that concerned. Obviously, the controversial, I just wanted to, lay out remind the rest of the council, the controversial issue is biking. And if there is any disagreement on that, then we should take a vote. I of course support the language of biking being in there. I think, I'm guessing a majority of the council does, but if there is any disagreement, we might as well we could just hash it out now and save our work later on.
I think it looks like we're in agreement.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
I would also like to keep in the scientific research because there is a citizen science program that's going on right now with Transition Fidalgo, and I think it doesn't hurt to keep it in there because that is one of the things that is done out there. I don't think it hurts to include it. And back to Mr. Walters' point, I don't understand that provided herein. What does that even mean in the red?
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
Yeah, the prior construction that staff had that this exemption does not include list, I think is a better construction than the old ordinance. Also, that old text, which is now the proposed red text, says, or as authorized by a critical area permit, well, yeah, if it's authorized by a critical area permit, then it doesn't need to be an exemption because they got a permit. Like, that doesn't make any sense either. So that old text should go away.
I agree.
And I don't think that anybody has ever had a problem with biking, which is why there's like no discussion about it here on council. I wish that we had put that controversy to rest quite some time ago.
Well, we are tonight, so.
Very good. Thank you. That's very helpful feedback.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Young.
You know, I really just wanted to thank Ms. Cooper for recognizing the input that came not only from the public, and then and the team re-looking at it and then showing us those differences, but also finding a way to make it work when it made sense. And I really noticed that in how you're presenting this, and I really appreciated that, and I just wanted to let you know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young.
Thank you. All right, any other comments on this section? Okay, Ms. Cooper?
Okay, a simple change that staff noticed for the recreation area, operation, maintenance, repair, and replacement. Again, when we're talking about the Anacortes forest lands, community forest lands, that are overseen by, of course, conservation easement, deed restrictions, as well as their comprehensive plan and their use requirements and rules, is that we were given a section of parks that allows, or forest that allows motorized trails, that's allowed, that's in the deed restriction, that we're intended to continue that use. And so for the words non-motorized trails to be allowed under the exemption was limiting our ability to repair the existing facilities that we have. And so we've proposed, and this is, again, a new change proposed that didn't get caught at the Planning Commission level, that we propose to remove the word non-motorized, so we don't limit ourselves to the amount of maintenance and repair that we can do to the wonderful network of forest lands that has been given to us with specific purposes.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters?
I concur with the recommendation to delete those words. It's maintenance of existing stuff. And to be clear, this is not the place in the critical areas ordinance to regulate the ACFL. They should be subject to the rules that everybody else is, but the special rules for the ACFL shouldn't go in the critical areas ordinance.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Moulton?
I want to say I agree with Mr. Walters on that point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, this moves us on to the permitted alterations, unless there was any of the exemption categories that popped up in our heads as we were discussing that we should go through and talk about. Otherwise, the new category for permitted alterations, the applicability of this section is to specify that an applicant may seek an alteration of a critical area or critical area buffer through a permitted alteration when the application of standards renders compliance with these provisions as infeasible and the proposed development meets specific terms under these sections, and it can be considered a reasonable use. Buffer alterations, buffer averaging, potential buffer reduction, or buffer additions falls under this category. Previously, in order to do a buffer averaging, there was no land use approval or review. It was just looked at during the building permit. So this is adding an additional level of review and requirements under the permitted alteration so that there's a land use review process for buffer averaging proposals. Roads, public roads and utilities are considered permitted alterations and outright reasonable uses. Conservation, restoration, and fish habitat enhancement projects, chemical applications, recreational areas and facilities, single-family residences and necessary appurtenances, any proposed alteration to the Anacortes community forest land. This is, so you can see the three that are highlighted in red. We'll talk about those sections specifically. They have proposed changes through Planning Commission that we'll talk about in a little bit further detail. Previously, the Anacortes community forest lands was included in the recreational areas and facilities, but because it was a little bit different, it's considered a critical area in and of itself and not just an area with critical areas and buffers. Administratively, it made sense to remove it and create its own listing under this section so that it can have its own specific review criteria and permitting standards. And then necessary for administrative purposes, we realized that, and this is a new one that is coming to you, and it was missed at Planning Commission stage. Under the critical area aquifer recharge areas, there's regulated activities, and so those need to go through a permitted alteration permit. So it just was necessary to add those to the list. The discussion here, again, a lot of folks get caught up on the term reasonable use and how it's a nebulous term. Single-family residences have been added to this list as a permitted alteration instead of a conditional use permit, because if we're looking at the zoning, a residential zoning, when you're talking about the least amount of impactive use possible, well, in residential zones, the only approved use is residential. You're not allowed accessory uses, so we're not going to allow you to just put a garage or a shed or an ADU on this lot as a minimal use to limit impact. Zoning says that your primary use is a single-family residence. And so in a residential zoned area, the only reasonable use for that lot without a regulatory taking is, in fact, a single-family residence. So that's why we've included those into this permitting process. Still means that you have to meet the mitigation sequencing. You have to avoid it as much as possible. You have to minimize it as much as possible. You have to repair and replace. You can't just build a 5,000 square foot home if you'd like to. You have to meet standards where that nebulous term reasonable use comes from. But again, it's just in this section to facilitate residential development and not catch property owners in the really difficult conditional use permit process.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
Before we go to this next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that last one. First of all, in this section, we say that you have to get a critical area permit for a permitted alteration. That's in subsection C of 045. Are we calling this a critical area permit, or are we calling this a permitted alteration permit? Or are those both new concepts that we're doing?
They're both new concepts, and we have combined it into a critical area permitted alteration permit.
Okay, so are we going to put that language in the table in 1920-030 where it lists all the types of decisions and the types of permits?
Exactly, and if you look at the list of changes, in which we'll go through at the end of all of these three presentations, all the administrative changes, yes, if you look at the draft list of planning commission changes, that is listed on there as a needed requirement.
Okay.
Table 1920-030 require administratively type 1, type 2, and type 3 permits will be added to that table in 19.
Okay, so I just would request some harmonization of the language so that we're always calling it the same thing, whatever the title of this new permit is. And then with respect to single-family residences, I know some jurisdictions, maybe it's either Whatcom or Bellingham, have articulated what a reasonable use exception gets you in terms of a single-family residence in a lot that is heavily encumbered by critical areas. What are we doing with respect to that?
We do have some limitations for that specified.
We don't have to go over them now if we were planning to go over them later.
Yep, we have very specific criteria that is required. I think you can do a maximum, if I recall, of 2,800 square feet of total alteration, and that's including your driveway, your garage, your walkways, your single-family residence. So we've put a square foot limitation on that.
Okay.
Okay. The next change to be discussed that was suggested by Planning Commission is under the permitted alterations, the previous wording in the draft was public services to allow development by a public agency when strict application of the standards. And of course, with some the public's concerns with public trails and other public amenities, we chose to specify and really clarify what the intent of this section is. So we changed the title to specifically public roads and utilities to allow public services when the strict application of standards of this chapter would otherwise reasonably prohibit the provisions of public amenities. And then we added section number 3, which was a request. So under this section, this is the title, and then these are the standards that must be met, standards 1, standards 2, standards 3. Department of Ecology requested that we add a standard 3 to this requirement. It will be a condition of any alterations granted a public agency and services exception that only the portion of the alteration that must be located in a critical area may be so located. So we just clarified the intent and then added the provision that they must be located only if that area, there's no other choice. So it's a straightforward one, not too much additional discussion necessary. Good?
Go ahead.
This one hopefully you can see. The next permitted alteration was recreational areas and facilities. Low impact activities which are consistent with the purpose and function of the critical area buffer and do not detract from its integrity may be permitted within the buffer. And originally this section, like we said, included the ACFL, but we've now removed the ACFL from this section and will create a section of its own underneath. The main issue was, you can see in this table here, we divided out whether it's allowed, this activity is allowed in the critical area itself or whether it's allowed in the buffer. And to have recreational facilities in all critical areas, including the ACFL, didn't work because the ACFL itself is the critical area. And so in order to include that here, we would have to put, yes, it's allowed in the critical area, but really we don't want to allow all of the other recreational facilities in the other critical areas, wetlands, geologically hazardous areas, and so forth. So that's the main intent of removing it, so it can remain that no, it's not allowed in the critical area for these, but yes, it's allowed in the buffer.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper, I just have a question about that first sentence. Recreational areas, facilities, low impact activities which are consistent with the purpose and function of the critical area buffer. What low impact activities would be consistent with the purpose of the critical area buffer? And my second part of that question is, it says that ones that do not detract from its integrity may be permitted within the buffer depending on the sensitivity of the critical area. How is that determined, the sensitivity of the critical area? Aren't they all sensitive?
Potentially some would be more congruent with others. This is language, again, this was an allowed activity, and this language is in the current. We just relocated it from its old position under Title 17 into Title 19 and put it into the new category. So there's certainly some wordsmithing and suggestions. I think obviously a nature interpretive trail where you're learning about the functions of a wetland and wetland buffer would be an example of a low impact activity that's consistent with the functions and purpose of that critical area buffer. So I think that's probably the intent of that language.
Okay, I would maybe take out with the purpose of, I don't know, that seems weird to me, but then also, yeah, depending on the I guess, I'm sorry, continue how we decide how sensitive the critical area is.
And that is through their assessment report. So if it's a highly sensitive critical area, it's potentially not going to be allowed for. I guess, yeah, it's an interesting wording there. In their report, in the review criteria would be where the evaluation of the sensitivity and the appropriateness of the proposed activity would come from.
Okay, so maybe that language is more, that's taken care of in that section rather than right here.
Yeah.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters.
I think that as we're starting to see here, we are going to encounter further difficulty with this concept of having the ACFL designated as a critical area. Property by virtue of it being added to an ACFL map really does not make it a critical area, except that we've written that down. If you have a lake, if you have a wetland, if you have some critical habitat, that should be designated as a critical area, and we should observe the buffers from those things. But then the entirety of the ACFL should not be a critical area. I think that designating the entirety of the ACFL a critical area reduces the value of the things that actually would be traditionally called critical areas. And this is our opportunity to get away from that. Even though it's been that way for a long time, it makes it harder to administer the rules. And here, it seems to me that a recreational area or facility, if you are allowed to build it in the privately owned forest next to the ACFL, you should be allowed to do it in the ACFL as well, subject to any special ACFL rules we have. But also, whatever you construct in the ACFL should have to follow the rules that are in the private forest, and I'm not sure that we're accomplishing that either. So I think that this gets really muddy when we call the ACFL a critical area, and if staff can tell me for some reason it's not muddy, then great, but it seems to me that it is, and I would like us to walk that back.
Mayor Geert?
Mr. Miller?
Mr. Walters makes an excellent point. It's what I've been thinking about the whole time when we first started talking about the ACFL. The problem is I would guess most of the ACFL is a Category 1 wetland, mature forest. I mean, that's the challenge. You're going to have to decide which way you want to go there. Do you want to define it that way, or try to create some separate, call it generally critical area, or create a separate ACFL rule? I mean, that's what is ultimately going to happen on a permit is when it's determined whether it's a Cat 1 or Cat 2 or Cat 3 wetland. And that's what we probably should be focusing on.
Other thoughts?
So the ACFL question, oh, sorry, Mayor Geer.
Go ahead.
The ACFL question is really interesting here because the ACFL has an advisory board. There's also the Parks Commission. So those are advisory boards appointed by the mayor. They make recommendations to the council, and then the council decides. So it's this whole democratic process that begins with discussion at the board level and comes to council for decisions on what is and is not appropriate usage of the ACFL. And that's worked really well for a long time, which is why we have one of the best multi-use trail systems and natural areas, bar none, anywhere that I've ever been. So it is ruled by the ACFL comp plan, the management plan. So that's where a lot of these decisions are made, not in the critical areas ordinance.
Mayor Geer?
Mr. Walters?
Well, I'm not suggesting we leave those decisions up to those advisory boards, though. You know, like the state is requiring us to protect wetlands or lakes. You know, we can't have rules that would allow the advisory board to say in some hypothetical distant future that, yeah, we need to fill in this part of the wetland here because we're going to make this, you know, awesome viewing station, you know, and we don't have to worry about the critical areas ordinance. We do have to worry about the critical areas ordinance. Those things should be run by the critical areas code because we as the city should be subject to the same rules that the private property owner next door is. If we want to impose additional rules on the ACFL, then great, because we can make our own rules that go beyond that. But we shouldn't be allowed to do things that the private property owner can't. Like if the private property owner wants to make a trail through the forest, they should be able to take advantage of this exception. And the Parks Department, if the Parks Department wants to make a trail through the forest, they should also be allowed to take advantage of this exception, so long as the exception is narrowly tailored and it serves the purpose of the critical areas protection overall. I just don't understand why we should have any special rules in the critical areas code for the ACFL. Let's write those more restrictive rules if we need them in some ACFL chapter.
Right. That's basically what I'm saying.
Hey, Geer?
Mr. Young?
I agree with Mr. Walters and Ms. Moulton on that too. I really do. I think that, again, we don't want rules that applies to one and doesn't apply to the other. And if they are critical areas, we should define them as such and allow those rules to come forward. So I'm in agreement with that.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Cooper, suggestions on how to move forward on that?
Yes, thank you. So this is a really good example for you all to see how the administrative application of the critical area ordinance is difficult when we're talking about the Anacortes Community Forest Lands. And next week, when we get to the designation of the marine fish and wildlife habitat areas, where previously we designated ACFL as a critical area, that's going to be the more appropriate discussion. So this is a good leeway and to get our brains thinking and how you can see how the administrative application of it is very difficult in having it there. And so I would say let's really table this discussion for next week. And because truly this section that we're talking about today is not talking about the ACFL. That is specifically what we did, was remove it from this section. And so it sounds like you're all in agreement that that makes sense. And so really we want to just make sure that we agree that recreational areas and facilities are allowed within all of the other critical areas and buffers, lakes, streams, wetlands, and so forth, through these specific standards. Limited public park recreational access, trails, wheeling platforms, fishing access, as long as they meet these specific criteria by the public agency, and then private pedestrian walkways, as long as they meet these specific criteria, which is recommended by the Department of Ecology. Trails are allowed in buffers as long as they're in the outer 25% of the buffer and so forth. So you helped illustrate the reason why the Planning Commission decided to remove it, the ACFL, from this specific requirement. And I just want to make sure that you agree with what is left in there then. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh. That makes sense to everybody else?
Here.
Yes, Mr. Walters.
Yeah, I would want to think about that a little bit more, but generally the concept I think works. I did have a question about number one. What is an S tree, or is that just missing letters?
Number one.
Yeah, it's listed as B, little b.
B, little b. Okay, thank you.
I think the numbering is probably not right there, but yeah, B, little b has an S trees.
The trail is located in the outer 25% of the buffer and designated to avoid removal of trees and native.
I think that's a typo.
Yep.
It's in the comment too, so maybe if we could figure out what that is. And then I wondered what was a fishing access. Is that a structure, or is that just a clearing?
Do we have any formal official fishing access points, or are they just clearings with existing facilities? Or I guess that's a good question for the Parks Department, what they would consider that.
Okay. Maybe we could get that and bring it back next week.
Mayor Gira?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
I have one more question on this section. Thank you, Ms. Cooper. On B, little b, so the trail is located in the outer 25% of the buffer area. How was that number arrived at?
That's taken directly from Department of Ecology's recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Great. As you can see, a small change that down below under C, and non-treated wood is used. That was a request from the Department of Ecology that we incorporated, and Planning Commission agreed and made a recommendation on. And then under D, when the language was carried over to the new draft, there was a section that was accidentally omitted, and so we added the language back in to finish that statement. The natural contour of the wetland except as authorized by special permit. So we added that language back in, and the Planning Commission agreed to that recommendation as well. So the three recommendations from Planning Commission really to agree to is removing the ACFL from this statement, adding the word non-treated wood, and correcting the language under D. Any additional discussion? Sounds like everybody's in agreement.
Maybe that,
Oh, no,
Mayor Gear,
Mr. Walters?
maybe that non-treated pilings should say non-treated wood pilings, because it's the treated wood that we're trying to avoid, but if we use something else, we're okay. I can't imagine using just regular wood.
Right, I think that's for trail crossings, footbridges, any type of wood in that type of facility. Signposts and so forth, not just pilings.
Oh, okay. So that makes replacement of pilings with wood quite a bit better.
As long as there's permanent infringement on hydrology and stream flow. Okay.
Hey, Gear.
Mr. Young?
Ms. Cooper, would you mind in the display going back to a 1 as opposed to the showcasing of the next slide, just so I can see clearer, if you won't mind? I think Mr. Walters said you go to display and then...
Oh, is it switched again?
Yeah, it's showing me too. It's showing the next slide, and so I was just wondering. Yeah, thank you.
Great, I don't know how that happened. Perfect. Okay, so you have the full screen view now. Yeah, that text is really small. I thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. So anything else on this before we move on?
We're through most of the meat and potatoes. I know there's quite a few other things on the agenda, so we should be able to get through the rest of this very quickly. That was the majority of all of the actual important discussion items.
Very good.
So I just wanted to take a little bit of time, and this might not be necessary, but there was a lot of, again, public comment and public concern about what the term reasonable use is and where it came from and how it's so subjective. How does that actually create a regulation that can be applied and administered? And just really quickly, I added the regulatory idea, the history of it in here, just for folks. It came from the natural flow doctrine under federal water rights, saying that that you could alter water courses if necessary to supply power with turning water wheels and hydroelectric power and for off-stream consumption. And that it is specifically meant to be context sensitive to each project specifically. And that was carried forward through Washington State and applied to regulatory takings cases. And it specifies that the decision maker must balance the public's interest against the owner's interest by considering the nature of the harm the regulation is intended to prevent, the availability and effectiveness of alternative measures, and the economic loss borne to the owner. So just to help folks understand that this is a very well understood regulatory term, both federally and Washington state, and that the planners and the third-party reviewers are meant to look at the specific context of each project individually and apply what reasonable use should be. I know people don't quite feel comfortable with that concept, but that's where it comes from and what the intent of it is. And so just as we go into next, the next general provision section was the reasonable use exception for critical area variance permits, and that the applicability of this is for all other development that does not fall as an exemption, mostly multifamily commercial use that is more of a large-scale major alteration, and that they're subject to very strict variance criteria. They do have pre-decision open public record hearings for the public process of these projects, and that we've changed final approval for these decisions because there is so much legal ramifications on these decisions with the hearing examiner, which is a protection to the city and our risk management on making development decisions.
Manager?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper, could you talk very briefly about the nature of regulatory takings? I don't know if that concept is universally understood.
Maybe Dawn Meismer might want to step in and answer that question a little bit more detailed than I can. Dawn?
Well, I think, excuse me, Mayor Gear, this is Don. I think that would probably best be answered by the city attorney, more knowledgeable on that.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we can ask Darcy and just get a definition for our next meeting, because I think that would be helpful to help flesh out more of that conversation about reasonable use of regulatory takings and what that means.
Absolutely.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Miller.
So I'll give you my my interpretation of what that means in the context of what we're going to be discussing over the next couple of weeks as we go through the critical areas update. One example might be you've increased a wetland buffer by 100 feet, and a property owner might not be able to do what that property owner wanted to do in that additional 100 feet. That could be interpreted by some people as a regulatory take.
Okay.
The basic concept is denying reasonable economic use of a piece of property to the property owner.
By the enactment of regulations, right? It's like a regulation that takes away what you could possibly formerly do with the property. But now that there's a regulation, now you're not allowed to. Is that the gist?
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Miller.
That's my interpretation of regulatory taking, and that's why this is such critical work. Because when you think of wetland buffers, some people can think of those as restricted areas as well. So again, I know we're not talking about wetland buffers, but that's one of the big things we're going to do with that. And one of the first things I did was look at our City of Anacortes wetlands map, which is a draft that's been around for a long time. Doesn't go into the details of what those are, but it's really important to understand the effects of what we're going to do with these regulations. Granted, I know we have to comply with state law and all that, but we need to think about the impacts that we're going to have should we make these changes, considering huge parts of Anacortes are technically Category 1 wetlands.
Okay.
since next week we'll be discussing wetlands and buffers and the proposed changes, then that sounds like a great place. I will invite Darcy to have a little bit of an explanation prepared for us under that topic.
All right. So what are we? Page 21.
Great. We made it through the first section. We are completely through general provisions. On to the second new section, critical areas review procedures. And the majority of these are not new. They were all requirements previously, but they were separately called out under each section specifically. What do the wetland reports and wetland mitigation requirements as opposed to the different sections? And staff felt that they're all very similar and that we could consolidate and eliminate redundancies by pulling them out of each section, making them apply to all, and adding them up front in the very beginning of the title to really describe what requirements are. And you can see here, I've color-coded it, and it might be a little hard to see on the screen, the colors I chose. Blue are new, black were current, and so the major, we've already talked about the mitigation requirements and the mandatory mitigation sequencing. The first, what we've decided to do is an identification form, and this goes back to answering a little bit of your question under the general requirements, the city shall, whether it's critical area review or general permit review. What we're proposing to do and what other jurisdictions do is include a general critical area identification form with each and every single development permit or building permit that comes in. It's just a quick questionnaire that gets the property owners thinking about what is on their property as to whether or not there are critical areas that they're subject to or not. At this stage, it's an honor system. People, we trust that they know, or that their professionals they're hiring know. But it will also give us as a department better inventory and better understanding of what's out there. So just every time somebody comes in to pull a permit for any type of activity, we're proposing that we put in a simple critical area identification form to ask some questions and get them thinking about whether there are requirements or not. Critical area reports, it spells out what requirements are meant to be in those.
Mary,
Mr. Walters.
I've worked with these critical areas checklists before, and I kind of think that they are pretty useless because, you know, people just check the box, no bald eagles, no. But I guess ecology thinks they have value. What wasn't clear to me here in this section, though, is it references permitted activities in AMC 1970-040, but 040 is about the exempt activities. So it wasn't clear to me from this sentence that it actually would be required with any building permit or land use permit that comes in through the department. So I think we ought to clarify that and correct the cross-reference or delete the cross-reference.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, any further questions on identification forms? Critical area reports? Mitigation requirements? Mitigation plan requirements? Title noticing, we've added a provision to allow the city to place a notice on title if there are critical area requirements buffer requirements or particular protection zones. This is especially helpful in buffer averaging cases, where under a permit we allow you to average, which is changing the shape and size of your buffer, but only the person that is doing that particular building activity would know that. If the property were to change hands and they would do another project, there's no record on file, or there's no record for new property owners to know unless they come into us to do a permit search on what their buffer requirements are. The section specifically just specifies what field markings must be on site so that everything is standard. It adds a provision to allow construction plan review and send it out for third party. This is new so that we can request fees, reimbursement, and ask for additional review with third party experts. And then financial guarantee requirements, bonding, unauthorized alterations, what happens for violations, and final decisions and appeals. So again, these are just the overall arching requirements for all critical areas up front.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
In 1971-15 critical area report, it says that the decision maker gets to determine when a proposed development has to go get a critical area report, and then it calls it a critical areas assessment report. I think that we should harmonize the terms, make sure that we're only calling that report one thing. But also I think that the director, the department head, should be able to require the report, not the decision maker, because the decision maker could be the hearing examiner if we think it's going to rise to a type 3 permit. And the hearing examiner is not involved at the outset. It's just the department. So the department should be able to determine, yeah, you got to go get a critical area report.
Okay. Thank you.
And then, you know, it goes on, and the department should also be able to require a third-party review. It shouldn't have to wait for the hearing examiner. Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
So also the title notice thing, I think it serves some purpose, because then somebody buying a piece of property 5 minutes before they sign all of the papers buying the piece of property will see that in the office there at their closing agent and notice the notice on title. I think it would be better though, because it does cost, you know, $100 to record these things, and all these fees just start adding up. Maybe in addition, maybe not replacing this, but in addition, it would be great if we put the onus on the city to keep the map and keep these records in an interactive map, so that a property owner or a potential purchaser could go to that all-encompassing city map and get this information. Because just having it in the title record, at Skagit County they do that, and they don't keep track of it anywhere else. So it's only in a bunch of title records that are not in a database anywhere. And it is really a big expense and a waste of time for the county to try to keep track of those things. It's essentially an impossibility. If it were in a database and on an interactive map, it would be relatively simple.
Okay.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Young.
This question is directed to Mr. Walters or anyone that might be able to answer it. Then, Mr. Walters, how could a new property owner, let's say moving into the area, how would they know to look on the Anacortes website? Is there a way we could sort of tie the two together? I guess my challenge is that I'm trying to understand if a new person moving to our area in this title notice, is there a way that they would be alerted to it in much more of an easy manner, as opposed to believing that they can come to the city and decide to look and see if there's any encumbrances?
Here.
Mr. Walters.
Yeah, I think that is an ongoing challenge. If there is a title notice, then there's some chance that somebody doing due diligence gets a title report and gets that notice and reads it in advance. I just don't have any confidence that normal residential property buyers do that. I think it'd be great if the city had, outreach associated with that. If you're thinking of buying property in the city of Anacortes, here's a bunch of the considerations, and it's not just this, it's also what utilities and where you can get fiber and all that kind of stuff. But it is definitely a challenge. It's a much greater challenge in unincorporated Skagit County, where the rules could be much more severe in certain areas, like you might not be able to get water at all. But inside the city, it's maybe less severe of an issue, but still, it's an ongoing challenge.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Young.
Yeah, if I can add, I think in my work, I served on the Property Tax Commission for the state, and it was, a challenge in people coming forward to the commission to hear, to adjudicate the cases that came out of the counties. And if there's a way we can do that, I think it would be of great benefit to the owners, and it would make it so much easier as opposed to sometimes being buried and finding out later. I just think if we could find a way to do that, I would love that. Thank you.
Mayor Gear.
Yes, Ms. Cleland.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, that we do have a pretty extensive mapping service that not only includes, we've got it for our cemeteries and whatnot. I believe there's a specific map that has all of the permits for each parcel that has been done through the city. I mean, that seems like a pretty reasonable place to add this information in. I know it's not easy unless you know that this map exists, but I know that I've shared that with colleagues. And if we continue to encourage, real estate agents and whatnot to be aware of it, and our community members, that seems like a reasonable place for someone to go and look up a parcel number that's within the city limits and see that additional information when it becomes available. I mean, I also think that people typically review a preliminary title report, which would also include that information. So that's all I wanted to add.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Mayor Gear.
Yes, Ms. Cooper.
So, yes, comprehensive mapping and the title reports are both tools for new property owners who are changing in ownership. And as much outreach and education we could do to realtors and property owners and folks moving in, there's certainly potential to do that. I do want to point out that it's the purpose of a title notice is not also just for change in property. It can also be, so when you're allowing an alteration of a critical area, it's really an onus instead of the honor system, it's really a tool in making sure that the property owner or the contractor that does the alteration stays honest and continues to carry forward those conditions of approval instead of, from my experience, code enforcement and dealing with violations. Once the permitting will agree to do what we say we're going to do, now, while we're in the permitting process, once we get our final inspection and the city goes away, then we can do whatever we want to do after they're gone. And so title notice is also a way of keeping those property owners honest and not necessarily, it's not, the purpose isn't not necessarily just for notifying the next person to own that property. So there's multiple purposes and benefits of that process, as well as property owner, just as well as the maps and the realtors and doing your research on a piece of property. And part of this discussion, ultimately, yes, it would be nice for that property owners and potential purchasers to have that information at their fingertips. In my experience, that it is ultimately going to fall on the hands of the staff at the city. And when you were talking about comprehensive databases and keeping track of these records, yes, having the public accessible to them, but this is really, really the main purpose and the main necessity of having a good quality permit tracking database where we can tag and flag parcel numbers, link them to the permits and the permit conditions, and have all of those feedback, connection, red flag, notice. So if somebody in the Public Works Department is approving a right-of-way permit for an arbor, they know what the Planning Department has said for the wetland buffer conditions and so forth. All the departments can talk to each other, all of the permits, all of the parcel numbers, having a really quality database to make flags on property and having conditions and so forth for all city staff to be able to see and review is really the ultimate outcome, is going to be the best outcome for this discussion purposes.
Well, wonderful. Any other comments?
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Fulton.
Thank you. I have one last question, Ms. Cooper. I was looking at the penalties for violating the provisions of the chapter, and they are monetary, $3 per square foot of impacted critical area buffer and $15 per square foot of impacted critical area. It seems to me in a quick look at our existing critical areas ordinance, there was talk of misdemeanor charges. Is that somewhere else in this updated document, or is that not, is that we're taking that out and doing this instead?
I think this is modeled, taking the modeled approach from other jurisdictions, getting civil criminal citations linked with code violations and getting the prosecutor's office or the police department. This just makes it for notice of violations and penalties, it makes it a cleaner system. Instead of involving the multiple departments to be able to levy fines and penalties without involving, with our actually our legal, what's the word I'm looking for? Authority, with our department's legal authority. It is just a model that we borrowed from others. That certainly the model or the dollar amounts are up for discussion and suggestion.
Yeah, maybe it's something to think about. I just was looking at it, so I don't have any firm ideas, but I suppose depending on what I was getting as a violator for my violation, how my benefit of what I was doing in violation weighed against the cost of paying for my violation. I guess at some point maybe we could look at that. I don't know if now's the time, but it's something to think about.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
Yeah, I think it's important that the financial penalties there make sense and are actually usable as a penalty and persuade people to not violate the code. Because I don't think we want to charge people with misdemeanors. However, it's not necessary for it to state that we can charge people for a misdemeanor for a violation of the code, because that's in AMC 1.24, which makes any provision of any mandatory requirement of the municipal code is a misdemeanor if you violate it. So there's always that possibility, which, you know, you could see if there was some super egregious violation, someone wanting to prosecute that as a misdemeanor. But otherwise, we, as a general matter, should be just doing these civil violations. And we should make sure those numbers make sense.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Matt.
I just wanted to make one more comment about the map. I think there's a lot of support for the map. I realize how challenging it is to lay out a map like that. but there's never a more important time to have a map when next week I think we're going to talk about the impact of changing buffers to probably hundreds of property owners, if not more, in Anacortes. And without having a map, I mean, typically we'd inform folks, hey, if you're within 300 feet of something, some land use action, you're going to get informed. Well, you know, they're not going to have that information. There's never been a more important time to have that map. So again, if you're happen to be a citizen out watching, if you've hung in there that long, please take a look at how some of the impacts might, you know, look at the critical areas map and see how this might impact you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. That's an important message for the public.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
I agree with Mr. Miller. I don't know that we're going to have a lot of leeway in the buffer widths. It seems like we might be required to do these, but that doesn't mean that we don't have leeway in some of the other provisions of the code that might make development harder or easier. And I wonder if we could be presented with a map of take just wetlands and streams. I think that I'm fairly confident we know where most of those are and that we have all of those on a map, and that if we could be presented with that map plus the parcel layer, so we could see what parcels would be affected and show buffers as existing and buffers as will change, that would be very useful. It would help us do our due diligence that we have tried to make sure there aren't unanticipated consequences of these code changes, where we could have fixed something relatively easily and didn't. I would also encourage council members to check out the City of Bellingham's mapping tech, because they've got, if you want to do development there, you can pull up your parcel and see where all the pipelines, wetlands, everything is on one map, and it makes it really easy. That's really something that I would like us to achieve here in the city of Anacortes.
Really good discussion tonight and a really great presentation, Ms. Cooper. Is there any final closing thoughts? And we'll be back next week to review more. Okay, wetlands and fish and wildlife, and then anything from today that's kind of hanging out there, we could probably bring that up too. Correct, Ms. Cooper?
That's correct.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. At this time, then, I'm going to close that part of our evening, and we're going to move on to item 5B under other business. This is Resolution 2097, and also at the same time, I'll have Mr. Hogan who's going to walk us through this. He'll move on to Resolution 2098, right after Resolution 2097. Mr. Hoagland. Thank you, Ms. Cooper.
Thank you.
Mr. Hoagland, you're on.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council, and members of the audience. Mr. Miller did a nice introduction earlier tonight, or a nice preview of the Public Safety Committee, where these two MOAs, Memorandum of Understandings, were discussed. So I was trying to negotiate my way to the resolution, so you could at least see the resolution number and the title. So as you know, Vanessa Braun-Sima, our former HR director, has left the city. Her last day was August 5th. Before she did, she reached out to the iaff, International Association of Firefighters, reached out to the firefighter union. They worked together to come to an agreement for extending the contract, the labor agreement, which expires the end of this year. So it's the agreement that's in place now just gets extended another 12 months through the end of fiscal year 2021. What the MOA incorporates is a 2% COLA, cost of living allowance, and it also addresses an issue that came up with Kelly Days. The issue of Kelly Days came up because of a revision within the, I believe it was the Fair Labor Standards Act, revised the way hours were calculated. And a Kelly Day, a Kelly Day allows a firefighter additional time off in lieu of getting paid overtime for additional hours they work because of the non-traditional schedules that they work. So that Kelly Day was just a byproduct of that revised calculation from the FLSA. So that's kind of the basis of it. It's a 2% extension. I know there are a lot of unknowns in the economy right now. Like right now, well, as of the end of June, they haven't released July yet, but the end of June, CPI was 0.6. 2% is significantly higher than that, but a year ago, you may remember, we were at 2.5. 3 months ago, we were at 0. So things do seem to be coming back in the economy. Generally, or kind of historically, if we had an HR director in place with a contract expiring in 4 months, they would be in the thick of renegotiating that contract. Our probably best case scenarios, we're looking at early October to get a new HR director in. The timing and logistics of having that person take this on in such a shortened window just really isn't reasonable. At my opinion, I've looked at where our finances are incorporating, this 2% proposed COLA into our budget for next year, and I think this is a very reasonable option. I do believe that Chief Oliveri is on the line if there are any other detailed questions, particularly about Kelly Days. But I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you might have or entertain a motion.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller?
Yeah, typically I would be given Mr. Hoagland and our HR director a little harder time about a 2% COLA. But in light of, the way things are now, I support the contract extension because I think we really would like to have stability in both our major public safety departments. So, I support this, and I move that we approve Resolution 2097, authorizes extension of the IAFF contract with 2% COLA through 2021.
Is that you, Mr. Walters? I couldn't see who said. Yes, okay. So at this time, is there any discussion? At this time, we have a motion by Mr. Miller, a second by Mr. Walters to approve Resolution 2097. Ms. Hunt, would you take the vote?
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Mr. Walters?
Yes.
Ms. Cleland McGrath?
Yes.
Ms. Moulton?
Yes.
I will note that Mr. McDougall has left the meeting, so he will not be voting on this matter. Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Okay, motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Hoagland, will you take us to item 5C, Resolution 2098?
Thank you, Mayor. This resolution is exactly the same thing, except this is for the Police Guild non-commissioned staff. It's the same COLA, 2%. The one other item in this MOA or MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, it incorporates a 2% COLA. It also incorporates a third floating holiday, and that brings those staff to the same level of personal days as the other city staff. So it brings parity to the non-commissioned staff as well. So again, I believe Chief Small is on the line. If there are any questions he might be able to address, or I'm happy to address any questions you might have or entertain a motion.
I move we approve Resolution 2098 as described by Mr. Hoagland.
Thank you.
Second?
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Young, a second by Ms. Moulton. Is there any discussion? Okay, so we have a motion and a second to approve Resolution 2098. Ms. Hunt, would you take the vote?
Mr. Walters?
Yes.
Ms. Cleland McGrath?
Yes.
Ms. Moulton?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mr. Hovland. Appreciate your time. Thanks, Chief Small and Chief Oliveri. All right, so the final item on the agenda this evening, which is open for public comment, is Ordinance 3070, accepting the donation of murals from the Bill Mitchell Estate for the Anacortes Mural Project. So I'll have Mr. Lunsford do his presentation, and then Mr. Kaufman, if there's anyone that would like to speak, I will call on them at that time. Thank you. Mr. Lunsford, welcome.
So, I will just go straight to my slideshow and share that. Boy, I learned a lot tonight. So first, of course, we thank Bill Mitchell for his work and the Mitchell family for their willingness to make this donation to the city. It all started in the early 80s. This is the inauguration of the mural project. And an overview is that the family of Bill Mitchell has offered to donate to the city of Anacortes and the Anacortes Museum approximately 140 murals. Because of the value of the murals offered and the long-term obligation, the donation may only be accepted by action of the city council. This is the draft that was in your packet of Ordinance 3070. I don't plan to read it all tonight, but I did use it as the last slide if we want to revisit it at that point. I'll say this project is up and running already and has been for decades. It's a proven success, and the main goal of the museum's involvement would be to sustain it. So we've already created a preliminary inventory of the murals that museum staff have towards the different ways that we will be accessioning it into our collection. Ideally, this is a page from that inventory, which has grown more detailed from this point. And museum staff has the capacity to manage the project along with community volunteers. We have a collaborative plan with the Anacortes Museum Foundation for funding the maintenance and interpretation and other promotional projects. And the Anacortes Museum Foundation has committed to raising $5,000 annually to support the stewardship of the Anacortes Mural Project, which is our estimated annual amount that it will cost. And there's some other examples of things that we've already done and that the Museum Foundation has done. You can watch the video that museum staff created of the mural project, which is a great introduction to the community. We've also helped to promote a new coloring book that was produced in conjunction with Pictures That Matter, and it's with funds going to be designated to the museum stewardship project. And so upon council approval, the city will enter into mural placement agreements with the owners of the structures where the murals are currently attached. And then from that point, following the execution of each individual mural's placement agreement, the mural will be accessioned into the Anacortes Museum collection. And that would follow our normal practice where we have tens of thousands of items already accessioned to the collection. This is an example of the page from our online catalog where the currently owned city murals are. So as we accession, they would enter into the collection and the database. So that's the short overview. Again, thank you to Bill Mitchell for his vision and his lifelong project devoted to the arts, and the Mitchell family for their willingness to sustain it by putting it in the Anacortes Museum's hands. So with that, I will answer any questions the council has.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters?
Yeah, I thought this was pretty simple, but actually I have a question now. Why are we doing this by ordinance?
In consultation with city attorney, this is what she proposed, and so I defer to her professional judgment.
I wonder if we are planning to codify it, because it does have this long-term, potentially forever obligation of us to offer the chance to reclaim a deaccessioned mural. And I worry about like how we keep track of such things.
Well, the Anacortes Museum accession policy, we have records of everything, that every negative, every photo ultimately goes through our accession process, and then as a matter of record within museum files and under museum policy that are reviewed by our Museums Collections Committee, which has weighed in on this, as has the advisory board. So in that way, it wouldn't be different than anything else that comes into the museum. It's just that the size of it in bulk it merits the council approval because of its value. So these will become any other piece of the Anacortes Museum collection, except that they're made for external exhibit for as long as they are in the shape to allow that.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller?
Mr. Lunsford, are most of the pieces out, or are most of the pieces not out?
Most of the pieces are out.
Okay.
On display. Bill had a high standard for, he wasn't satisfied until they were 100%. And we will be looking at, the need to perhaps move some based on whatever the building owner is in the mood for, or ones that just in the span of the past year have needed to be come down because they've been weathered to the point where
So not too much of a space issue for you, because I was guessing that most of them were already out and about. It's just a matter of doing some sort of agreement with the building owners and figuring out the maintenance process.
Correct.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Young.
Just to Mr. Lunsford's point, I remember a distinct conversation with him about his murals and what he felt about it. I'm sure all of us have our pleasant memories of Bill giving us a call and having those lengthy conversations that would start out as a 10-minute conversation but would go further than that. But he was always so wonderful about his work and trying to collect it and maintain it. And he always wanted this thing, it to be in a museum. But so I love and support this, and it just brought back pleasant memories of Bill and those conversations that I've had with him personally. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, Mr. Kaufman, is there anyone in the public that wants to address the council on this?
There are currently nobody with their hands raised.
Okay, all right. Thank you. So, any other discussion? Thoughts?
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Moulton?
I just want to thank Mr. Lunsford for such a good presentation. For as brief as it was, you really conveyed a lot about the coloring book and the inventory and everything, and it was really good. Thanks, and I support this the acceptance of this donation, and I would like to move that we approve Ordinance 3070, accepting the donation of the murals from the Bill Mitchell Estate for the Anacortes Mural Project. Sorry.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Ms. Moulton, a second by Mr. Young, for approval of 3070, Ordinance 3070. Ms. Hunt, would you take the vote?
Ms. Cleland McGrath?
Yes.
Ms. Moulton?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Young,
Yes.
Mr. Walters,
Yes.
motion carries.
Thank you. What a great evening, a good long discussion tonight, good important work, and we welcome the public back. So that was really a wonderful thing this evening. So at this time, barring any other comments from the council.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Wilson.
Can Mr. Kaufman tell us how many people attended our Zoom meeting tonight, our very first one for the public?
Yes, at any given time we had about, I think it was 7 attendees at one point, and they just kind of trickled in and trickled out a bit.
Okay, well, we'll hope for more ongoing. Thank you. Thanks for getting that set up.
Yeah, that was a great start. Okay, well, at this time, I'll adjourn the Anacortes City Council meeting. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye-bye.